They did not look away when the carriage door opened. They watched. Every soul assembled in the rain-slicked courtyard of St. Crispin's parish stood motionless, as though the grey November morning had pressed them into the cobblestones, like figures stamped into cold wax. The women clasped their hands, the men lowered their chins, and not one of them spoke, because not one of them needed to. The scene before them communicated, with perfect and devastating efficiency, everything that polite society would spend the next fortnight whispering over tea. A bride had stepped onto the wet stone. She was striking in the way that fury sometimes makes a woman striking, sharp, luminous, and entirely unwilling to be diminished. Her gown was white silk and Honiton lace, fitted to a figure that held itself with the rigid precision of someone who had decided somewhere between the carriage and the courtyard that she would not be seen to break. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a modest veil, and her chin, that chin, was lifted at an angle that dared the assembled witnesses to offer her their pity. Her name was Grace Sinclair. She was 24 years of age, and she was not weeping. This was perhaps the most unsettling thing about her. Grace Sinclair had not wept. She had calculated. Behind those steady dark eyes, legal arguments assembled and dismantled themselves with the quiet efficiency of a mind that had spent years sharpening itself in secret, by candlelight, on borrowed volumes of Blackstone's commentaries. She had already identified 3 potential grounds for annulment before the vicar had even located his scripture. Beside her, seated in a rusted wheelchair draped in tattered grey wool, was the man the parish register would record as Kyle Adams. He was broad-shouldered beneath the ruin of his coat, his jaw carrying several days of neglect, his hands, calloused, weathered, resting loosely on the arms of the chair, the hands of a man who had allegedly known nothing but hard pavements and harder winters. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Grace. He looked with an expression of absolute and unreadable composure at some fixed point in the mid-distance, as though the spectacle of his own humiliation was a matter of only passing academic interest. His eyes were the problem. Grace had noticed them already in the brief and terrible moment their gazes had crossed at the church door. They were grey and still and dangerously precise, the eyes of a man solving an equation that no one else in the courtyard had been given the terms of. She filed this observation away. It sat beside the others. Behind them both, one step elevated on the church's stone threshold, stood Lady Madeline Sinclair in deep plum silk, her pearls catching the flat morning light. In her right hand, folded and sealed with black wax, was the marriage contract. She was smiling with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had just won a game she had spent 3 years arranging. Grace looked straight ahead and said nothing. Neither, she noted with cold precision, did he. Grace Sinclair had learned the law the way most women of her station learned embroidery, in stolen hours, by failing light, with the constant awareness that discovery would cost her everything. Her father's study occupied the eastern corner of the Sinclair townhouse on Aldgate Street, a room that smelled permanently of pipe tobacco, dried ink, and the particular mustiness of books that had been consulted rather than read. George Sinclair, solicitor of the Crown and fellow of Lincoln's Inn, kept his library with the careful disorder of a man who trusted only himself to navigate it. Volumes of Blackstone alongside Coke's Institutes. Precedent registers from 3 separate decades stacked in columns that leaned like tired men against the wainscoting. A copy of the Judicature Act of 1873 with his own annotations running up the margins in cramped, urgent script. Grace had read all of it. She had begun at 14, the year her mother died and Lady Madeline arrived, trailing perfume and calculation in equal measure. The study had been a refuge first, a room where Madeline did not linger, finding it, as she once announced to no one in particular, oppressively masculine. Grace had taken to slipping inside after supper, ostensibly to return a book on her father's behalf, and then simply remaining, perched in the worn leather chair behind the great oak desk, with the lamp turned low, and the door drawn almost, though never fully, shut. She read with the focused appetite of someone who understood instinctively that knowledge was the only form of property a woman of her era could accumulate without a man's signature on the deed. By 16, she understood the basic architecture of contract law. By 18, she had formed a private and thoroughly researched opinion on the inequities of the Married Women's Property Act. By 21, she had drafted, in a leather-bound notebook she kept beneath a loose board beneath her bed, what she considered a cogent argument for women's admission to the bar, an argument that cited 17 precedents and contained, she was quietly certain, no logical errors whatsoever. She had shown it to no one. Her father was not an unkind man. This was, in many ways, the most painful thing about him. George Sinclair possessed a genuine and well-documented affection for his daughter, alongside a genuine and equally well-documented inability to inconvenience himself on her behalf. He admired her mind in the abstract, the way one admires a particularly fine clock, with appreciation, without any intention of taking it apart to understand the mechanism. When Grace, at 19, had raised the possibility of sitting in on a case at the Old Bailey, he had patted her hand and said that she was too clever for her own good, and that cleverness in a young woman was best directed toward securing a husband who would appreciate it. Lady Madeline, overhearing this exchange from the hallway, had smiled and said nothing. She rarely needed to. The correspondence had begun 2 years prior, in the autumn of 1881, when Grace had written, carefully, in her most formal hand, under the name G. Sinclair, Esquire, to Mr. Edmund Rowe of Rowe and Partners, a progressive firm in Holborn that had, according to a small notice in the Journal, begun quietly accepting women as clerking assistants on a probationary basis. She had written 4 letters over the course of 6 weeks, careful letters, precise letters, letters that contained no mention of her sex and every demonstration of her competence. Mr. Rowe had written back. His 3rd reply had been an invitation. Grace had read it 3 times in the thin grey light of early morning, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom, with her heart conducting itself in a most undignified manner. The appointment was for the 14th of November. She had 6 weeks to manufacture a reason to be in Holborn on a Tuesday afternoon without arousing suspicion. She had never been given the chance. The 4th letter, Mr. Rowe's final confirmation, formal and official, addressed in his clerk's neat hand to Miss G. Sinclair, rather than the ambiguous G. Sinclair, Esquire, had arrived on a Wednesday morning while Grace was occupied with the household accounts. Lady Madeline had received the post herself that day. Grace had not learned of this until evening, when she came downstairs to find her stepmother seated at the writing desk in the drawing-room, the letter's envelope, already opened, resting at her elbow like a verdict. Madeline had not looked up immediately. She had finished the sentence she was composing, set down her pen with the unhurried precision of a woman entirely in command of the room's atmosphere, and then raised her eyes to Grace's with an expression of composed and pleasurable regret. "You have been conducting yourself rather ambitiously," she said. Grace said nothing. She had learned by then that words offered to Lady Madeline were words surrendered. "Your father will be disappointed," Madeline continued, folding her hands, "though I think, on reflection, it is kinder that he not know the extent of it." She let the implication settle over Grace like a net. The letter from Mr. Rowe was never mentioned again, the appointment was never kept, and Lady Madeline, Grace would later understand, had filed the knowledge of her stepdaughter's ambition away with the patient thoroughness of a woman who had already identified exactly how she intended to use it. She had simply been waiting for the right instrument. She had found one. Her father summoned her on a Thursday. This alone was unusual. George Sinclair did not summon people as a rule. He preferred to encounter them incidentally, in hallways or at breakfast, where conversations could be kept brief and any discomfort attributed to the inconvenience of the setting rather than the inadequacy of the man. A formal summons to the study, delivered by the housemaid with her eyes carefully averted, meant that Lady Madeline had determined the matter required witnesses, architecture, and the particular authority that a room full of law books lent to a man who was, beneath the leather bindings and the Lincoln's Inn credentials, fundamentally afraid of his own daughter's opinion of him. Grace had known something was coming. She had felt it assembling itself in the household atmosphere over the preceding fortnight, in the way Madeline moved through rooms with an almost musical composure, in the way her father had twice begun sentences at dinner and abandoned them before they became anything, in the way the housemaid had stopped meeting her eyes. She dressed carefully that morning, not beautifully, carefully. There was a distinction. She chose the grey wool with the high collar, pinned her hair without ornament, and regarded herself in the glass with the same dispassionate assessment she applied to a legal argument before committing it to paper. She looked, she decided, like a woman who had anticipated this conversation and was prepared to conduct herself within it without either sentiment or surrender. She was not entirely correct on either count. George Sinclair was standing when she entered, which meant he had intended to sit and then thought better of it, and had been standing long enough to look uncomfortable about the decision. He was a tall man, running gently to softness, his hair gone silver at the temples, his face carrying the flushed and slightly apologetic expression that Grace associated with moments when his conscience and his convenience were negotiating terms. Lady Madeline was seated to his left, perfectly composed in charcoal silk, her hands folded in her lap like a woman attending a recital she had already rehearsed. "Grace," her father said, "sit down." She sat. She folded her own hands. She waited. What followed was George Sinclair at his most characteristically indirect. He spoke for some minutes about the nature of professional obligation, about the complexity of certain financial instruments, about the manner in which a man of standing might, through no particular fault of his own, find himself navigating obligations that had accumulated with the quiet persistence of water finding its level. He used the word circumstances 4 times. He did not, for a considerable while, use the word debt. Grace waited. The debt, when it finally arrived in the conversation, was substantial. £43,000, owed to a consortium of creditors whose patience had, over the course of 18 months, transformed from professional courtesy into something considerably less pleasant. The origin of it was a land investment scheme that a colleague at Lincoln's Inn had presented as sound, and which had proven to be neither sound nor, as it subsequently emerged, entirely legal. Her father had not known about the illegality. This Grace believed without difficulty. George Sinclair was not a dishonest man. He was something in certain respects worse, a trusting one. "The creditors," Madeline said, speaking for the first time with the smooth efficiency of someone taking over a presentation that had gone on long enough, "have indicated they are prepared to be patient under specific conditions." Grace looked at her stepmother directly. "What conditions?" "The Sinclair name," Madeline said, "must remain unimpeachable. Any public scandal, any suggestion that the family is in disorder, that its members are conducting themselves in ways that invite scrutiny, would prompt an immediate call on the full sum." She paused. "Your correspondence with Mr. Rowe, for instance, should it become known, would constitute precisely the kind of disruption that—" "You would not," Grace said quietly. "I would not need to," Madeline replied. "These things have a way of surfacing. London is not as large as it imagines itself to be." The threat was elegant in its construction. It required no direct action from Madeline at all. It simply established that Grace's continued defiance carried a price that would be paid not by Grace alone, but by her father, the household, and every servant currently employed within it. Grace said nothing. She was busy dismantling the argument for weaknesses and finding, with a cold and rising recognition, that it had very few. It was her father who cleared his throat and introduced the solution. There was a man, a Mr. Kyle Adams. He had come through channels Madeline described only as discreet, with an arrangement attached. He required a wife of respectable birth. The reasons were not elaborated upon. He was, George Sinclair said, studying the window rather than his daughter's face, a man of limited means and limited mobility. The wedding would be quiet. The marriage would satisfy certain creditors who valued, above all else, the appearance of a family conducting its affairs in orderly fashion. "He is a beggar," Grace said flatly. Her father winced. "He is a man in reduced circumstances. He lives on Millhaven Lane. I have seen him." "Grace," she said, with a precision that she kept entirely level, "you are asking me to exchange my legal personhood for your financial errors." George Sinclair had no answer to this. He had known he would not. He looked briefly like a man who understood exactly what he was doing and decided that understanding it was sufficient penance. Lady Madeline looked at Grace with the expression of a woman holding a winning card and feeling no particular need to conceal it. "The ceremony," she said pleasantly, "is arranged for Saturday."
She met him on a Friday. Not by arrangement, or at least not by any arrangement Grace had been consulted on. She had spent the day after her father's summons in a state of contained and productive fury, working through every legal avenue available to a woman in her position with the systematic thoroughness of someone who refused to accept that all the doors were locked until she had personally tested every handle. She had filled 6 pages of her notebook. She had found 3 possibilities, 2 improbabilities, and 1 avenue so narrow it was less a legal argument than a philosophical one. She had not slept. By Friday evening, the house had taken on the specific quiet of a place where something has been decided and everyone is pretending otherwise. Her father had not appeared at dinner. Madeline had eaten with the serene appetite of a woman entirely at peace with the architecture of the immediate future. Grace had consumed approximately half a bread roll and excused herself early, citing a headache that was not technically a fabrication. She had been intending to return to her father's study. There was a volume on the legal status of marriage contracts under duress that she had not yet fully cross-referenced, and the particular argument she was constructing required one more precedent to stand without apology. She had told herself this as she descended the back staircase in her dressing gown, with the lamp turned to its lowest setting. She was retrieving a book, nothing more. She was not, under any interpretation, a woman reduced to creeping through her own house in the dark. The hallway outside the study ran the length of the ground floor's eastern wall, narrow and wood-paneled, smelling of beeswax and the cold draught that came perpetually through the gap beneath the servants' entrance. It was not a hallway anyone used without purpose. It offered nothing decorative and no comfortable passage between any 2 rooms that mattered. He was at the far end of it. Grace stopped. He was seated in the wheelchair, the same rusted contraption she had observed from the carriage during the brief and awful inspection Madeline had arranged 3 days prior, presented as a courtesy and functioning as a demonstration. In the dim hallway light, he was a study in shadow and stillness, his broad frame draped in the same grey wool coat, his hands resting on his knees with a quietness that was not the quietness of a man at rest, but of a man who had made a deliberate decision about how to occupy space. He was looking directly at her. Grace did not startle. She considered this afterward one of her finer moments.
She drew herself to her full height, adjusted the grip on the lamp, and met his gaze with the composed neutrality she had spent the better part of 24 years perfecting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. This was when she noticed his eyes. She had been close enough at the arranged inspection to observe that they were grey. She had catalogued this and moved on, occupied as she was with constructing legal arguments and managing the particular nausea of being presented to another human being as a transaction. But proximity and lamplight combined now to render them in considerably more detail. And what Grace Sinclair saw in the eyes of Kyle Adams, beggar, man of Millhaven Lane, her arranged and imminent husband, stopped every thought in her head with the clean efficiency of a judge's gavel. They were precise, not merely intelligent. Precision was a different quality entirely, rarer and more unsettling, the quality of a mind that did not simply gather information, but organized it, weighted it, and filed it in structures that served a purpose she could not yet identify. They moved across her face with a quiet, methodical attention that took in her dressing gown, her lamp, the notebook tucked under her left arm, the direction from which she had come, and the door toward which she had been heading, and they did all of this in approximately 4 seconds, and then they were still again, giving nothing back. It was, Grace thought, exactly the manner in which she read a legal document. She found this profoundly irritating. He did not speak. She had half expected some performance of deference, a downward glance, a mumbled apology for occupying a hallway in a house that was not his. Instead, he simply continued to look at her with that level, calculating attention, as though he were waiting for her to complete a sentence she had not yet begun. Grace looked pointedly at the notebook under her arm, then back at him, then at the study door. The meaning was precise. I am here for legitimate purpose. Account for yourself. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the ghost of an acknowledgement, there and then withdrawn before it could be examined. Then he moved the wheelchair back 2 inches, clearing the hallway with the minimal, efficient gesture of a man who had decided to allow her passage and wished her to understand it was a decision rather than a concession. Grace walked past him without a word. At the study door, she paused with her hand on the latch and looked back. He had not watched her go. He was facing forward again, his expression restored to its perfect, impenetrable stillness, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. His hands, she noticed, were resting on his knees with absolute calm. But his posture, broad shoulders set, spine straight, chin level, was not the posture of a beggar. She went into the study. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it in the dark for a moment longer than she would ever have admitted to anyone, her lamp in one hand and the notebook pressed against her ribs, and thought about those eyes. Then she lit the lamp fully and got to work. The morning of the wedding arrived without fanfare and without mercy. Grace had been awake since 4, not from nerves. She had decided somewhere around 2 in the morning that nerves were a luxury she could not presently afford, but from the relentless forward motion of a mind that had not yet found its solution and refused to stop looking. She had dressed herself without the housemaid, a deliberate choice. There was something insupportable about the idea of being assisted into this particular gown by someone whose expression would require managing. She wanted no witnesses to the private ceremony of a woman arming herself in white silk. The gown was her mother's, altered. This had been Madeline's suggestion, offered with the surface warmth of a woman performing sentiment and the underlying efficiency of one who understood that a detail like this would read to any observer as touching. Grace had accepted it without comment. The gown fit well. Her mother had been a woman of similar dimensions, and, Grace had always suspected, similar internal architecture, composed, capable, and underestimated until it was too late. She pinned her own hair. She did not carry flowers. Madeline had provided a small bouquet of white roses, which Grace left on the dressing table with the deliberate neutrality of a woman declining without dramatics to perform someone else's stage direction. She was ready by 7. The carriage was not due until 9. She spent the intervening 2 hours at her window, watching the street below with the focused inattention of someone whose thoughts are elsewhere and making no effort to conceal it from themselves. St. Crispin's parish was everything her father's position entitled him to avoid, and everything Lady Madeline's planning had deliberately selected. Small, peripheral, attended by witnesses whose discretion had presumably been arranged for rather than assumed. The cobblestoned courtyard, she had already seen it from the outside, had already lived through the carriage door and the assembled stairs and the awful theatre of arrival. Now she was inside, and the interior of the church offered its own particular atmosphere of damp stone and thin November light falling through windows that had not been cleaned with any recent conviction. Kyle Adams was already present. He was positioned to the left of the altar, in his wheelchair, dressed in a coat that was marginally less ruined than the one she had encountered in the hallway, an upgrade that suggested either some minimum of effort or Madeline's intervention to preserve a basic aesthetic standard. His hands were folded in his lap. He was looking at the stained glass window above the nave with an expression of absolute composure that Grace was beginning to find, on some level she had not fully examined, genuinely remarkable. He did not look at her as she took her place beside him. The vicar, a thin, hurried man who had the demeanor of someone conducting a transaction he wished to complete before lunch, moved through the service with the minimum possible embellishment. Madeline stood to one side in her plum silk, her folded document present as always, her smile operating at her customary low frequency of pleasure. George Sinclair stood slightly behind and to the right, examining a point on the flagstone floor with the sustained attention of a man who had decided that the floor was the most bearable thing in the room.
Grace said what was required of her. She said it clearly, without hesitation, because hesitation would have given Madeline something to interpret, and she had resolved to give Madeline nothing that could be used. Kyle Adams said what was required of him, in a voice that was quiet and unhurried, each word placed with an exactness that the vicar's own delivery conspicuously lacked. Grace noted this. She filed it beside the hallway. The register was brought forward immediately after, a large cloth-bound volume, its pages the color of old cream, attended by a pen that the vicar presented with the slightly proprietarial air of a man proud of his ink. He set it on the lectern and indicated with a gesture toward Kyle that the groom should sign first. Grace watched. What happened next was small and precise and landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Kyle Adams took the pen. He did not fumble with it. He did not grip it with the awkward unfamiliarity of a man whose hands were accustomed to a cap rather than a writing instrument. He held it with the easy, unthinking authority of someone for whom the act of writing was as natural as breathing. Thumb and forefinger settled in the correct position, wrist relaxed, the whole thing accomplished with a muscle memory that could not be manufactured and could not be borrowed. He signed his name. The signature was extraordinary, not merely legible, precise. The alphabets were even, the pressure confident, the hand that of a man educated not simply in the act of writing, but in the expectation of being read. There was a slight forward lean to the script, controlled and characteristically consistent, the kind of hand that emerged from years of correspondence that mattered, of documents that were legally binding, of a man who understood that his signature was an instrument of consequence. Grace stared at it for 2 full seconds longer than she should have. Then she took the pen from him. Their fingers did not touch, she had been careful about that, but in the moment of the transfer she was close enough to see his face in profile, and his expression was the same as it always was, composed, still, giving nothing. She signed her own name beneath his and straightened up. The vicar blotted the page with the satisfied air of a completed transaction. Grace looked at the register one last time before it was closed. Kyle Adams,
written in the hand of a man who was not, in any way that she could now argue reasonably, what he claimed to be. She folded this knowledge carefully and placed it where she kept the things that required further investigation, at the very front of her mind, where the lamplight reached.
She had prepared herself for the worst with a methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. In the 3 days between the summons and the ceremony, Grace had constructed, alongside her legal arguments, a parallel set of practical expectations. If she was to be deposited into poverty, she intended to arrive at poverty having already made her accommodations with it. She had packed one trunk, not the large one, which would have been optimistic, but the medium one, selected for its durability and the practicality of its interior dimensions. Into it she had placed 4 serviceable dresses, her winter coat, her notebook, 7 volumes from her father's library that she considered non-negotiable, a small amount of money she had accumulated over 2 years from household accounts managed with deliberate frugality, and a change of boots. She had not packed the silk evening gown. She had not packed the pearl earrings her mother had left her. These she had wrapped separately and hidden in the loose board cache beneath her bedroom floor on the reasonable assumption that she might, at some future point, require either their sentimental comfort or their monetary value, and that neither purpose was served by transporting them into a slum. She had formed a mental image of her destination with the grim precision of a lawyer preparing for an unfavorable judgment. Something on a narrow street, damp walls, a landlady possibly hostile, rooms that smelled of boiled vegetables and adjacent lives conducted at insufficient volume to ignore. She had decided she could endure this. She had decided, with the particular ferocity of a woman who has been given no alternative, that she could endure most things if she was permitted to think clearly within them. She was braced, in other words, for the predictable conclusion of a predictable cruelty. What was waiting in the courtyard of St. Crispin's was not that. The carriage stood to the left of the church gate, and Grace saw it the moment she stepped outside, saw it and stopped, just briefly, before her composure reasserted itself, and she continued walking at the same measured pace. It was not a fine carriage. It made no declaration of wealth, no ostentatious display of lacquered panels or gilded fittings, but it was substantial in a way that the word beggar had not prepared her for. The wood was dark and unmarked, without crest or insignia of any kind, and therein lay the first peculiarity. Not the absence of wealth, but the deliberate absence of identification. The horses were 2 matched bays, well-fed and well-kept, standing with the patient steadiness of animals accustomed to waiting without fidgeting, which meant they were accustomed to discipline, which meant whoever maintained them understood the difference between a horse that was merely adequate and one that was properly trained. Grace noted all of this in approximately 4 seconds. The man holding the reins was standing beside the lead horse with one hand resting lightly on the bridle. He was perhaps 40, built with the compact efficiency of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors in conditions that required physical competence rather than mere endurance. His coat was plain and dark, his boots were excellent, and his face was the face of a man who had decided at some point in his life his expressions were his own business and no one else's. He looked at Grace as she approached. He did not look at her the way the witnesses had looked at her, with the avid, uncomfortable hunger of people consuming a scandal. He looked at her the way one looks at a confirmed appointment, acknowledgement without commentary. "Miss Sinclair," he said. His voice was even and unhurried. "I'm Evan."
Nothing further. No title, no elaboration, just the name offered as sufficient, because apparently he had decided it was. Madeline had materialized at the church door, her document now absent, filed presumably in whatever archive she maintained for her victories, and was overseeing the transfer of Grace's trunk to the rear of the carriage with the composed satisfaction of a woman completing the final clause of a contract she had spent considerable effort drafting. She said nothing directly to Grace.
She had, Grace realized, said very little to her directly all morning. The silence was not neglect. It was the silence of a woman who had finished her work and saw no further need to engage with the instrument of it. George Sinclair had not come outside. Grace did not look back to see whether he was watching from a window. She made this decision consciously in the moment before it might have become involuntary, and she kept her eyes forward and her chin at its established angle, and she allowed Evan to open the carriage door with the brisk, professional efficiency of a man who performed this function as a matter of course rather than courtesy. Kyle Adams was already inside. He had been assisted in before her. She had observed this from the church doorway without appearing to, and he was seated against the far panel with his hands resting on his knees and his face arranged in its characteristic expression of unreadable composure. The wheelchair had been folded and secured to the rear of the carriage with a competence that suggested Evan had performed this specific task many times before. Grace stepped up. She sat, she arranged her skirts with precise economical movements and fixed her gaze on the window opposite. Evan closed the door. The latch engaged with a clean, well-maintained click, the click of mechanism that was regularly oiled, regularly inspected, regularly cared for by someone who took the condition of things seriously. The carriage moved off. Grace watched London's eastern edges pass beyond the glass and said nothing, and beside her, in the middle distance of his own private silence, neither did Kyle Adams. Outside, she did not look back. Behind her, she understood perfectly well, Lady Madeline was smiling. But ahead of her, something was wrong, or rather something was wrong with the story she had been given, and Grace Sinclair had always found, in the end, that wrongness correctly identified was simply a problem awaiting its solution. She opened her notebook. She began a new page.
She gave him 40 minutes. This was not generosity, it was strategy. 40 minutes was sufficient time for London's outer edges to give way to open road, for the rhythm of the carriage to settle into its travelling pace, and for any pretense that they were simply two people occupying the same space by coincidence to become too thin to maintain without mutual embarrassment. 40 minutes was also, she had calculated, approximately how long it took to reach the point on the northern road at which turning back became logistically inconvenient. The point, in other words, at which a conversation could not be forestalled by arrival or departure. She had used the 40 minutes productively. 4 pages of notes, 2 refined arguments, 1 discarded on the grounds that it required her father's cooperation, and she had updated her assessment of that particular variable. Outside, the city had thinned to hedgerows and grey November fields, occasional farmhouses standing at distances that suggested their inhabitants valued privacy with the same commitment Grace was currently applying to her notebook. Kyle Adams had not moved, spoken, or given any indication that he was aware of her presence beyond the minimal adjustment he had made upon her entry, a slight repositioning that cleared her skirts from any proximity to the wheel of the folded chair, accomplished without comment and, she suspected, without conscious deliberation. She closed her notebook. She placed it on the seat beside her with a deliberateness that announced to anyone paying attention that a different kind of work was about to commence. "I wish to discuss the legal status of this marriage," she said. He looked at her. The grey eyes settled on her face with their customary precision and waited. Grace took this as permission and continued. She had constructed the argument in 3 parts, which she considered the optimal architecture for dismantling a contract in front of a non-specialist audience. The first part concerned duress. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, she explained, in a tone she had calibrated to be informative rather than combative, established provisions under which a marriage contracted under conditions of coercion or undue influence could be challenged.
The circumstances of their arrangement, the debt, the threat, the absence of any genuine consent on her part, constituted, she argued, a sufficiently compelling case for duress to be raised before an ecclesiastical court. She paused here to allow this to settle, in the manner of a barrister permitting a jury to absorb a foundational point before proceeding. The second part concerned capacity, specifically the question of whether either party had entered the contract with full and informed understanding of its terms. Grace had not been provided with any documentation regarding her husband's circumstances, background, or the precise nature of the obligation her father had discharged through the arrangement. This informational asymmetry, she continued, constituted a potential basis for challenging the validity of consent on technical grounds, independent of the duress argument. The third part was the most elegant, and she was privately pleased with it. It concerned the question of identity. A marriage contracted to a named individual who could not be verified as that individual, whose background, history, and legal personhood remained entirely unsubstantiated, was a marriage whose foundational terms were, at minimum, challengeable. If Kyle Adams could not demonstrate to the satisfaction of a court that Kyle Adams was in fact who Kyle Adams claimed to be, then the contract itself rested on an unverified premise, and an unverified premise was not, in law, a foundation.
She finished. She held his gaze. She waited. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she began to consider the possibility that he simply did not intend to respond, that he would absorb her argument with those watchful grey eyes and offer nothing in return, and she would be left with the hollow and infuriating victory of having delivered an excellent speech to an empty room. Then he spoke. His voice was low and unhurried, the words placed with a quiet exactness that matched the precision she had observed in his signature and in his eyes and in every other detail of him that refused to cohere with the story she had been told. Hancock v. Hancock, 1865, Ecclesiastical Court of Arches. A petition for nullity on grounds of duress was denied on the basis that the petitioner had demonstrated capacity to object prior to the ceremony and had not done so. The court held that the existence of external pressure does not constitute legal duress where the petitioning party possessed, at the time of contracting, both the knowledge of that pressure and the theoretical means to resist it. He paused. You studied the legal arguments, he continued with the same unhurried evenness, before the ceremony. You did not raise them before the ceremony. The court will ask why. Hancock stared at him. He was not finished. Your second argument fails on Smythe v. Registrar General, 1871, which established that informational asymmetry between parties does not invalidate consent where the consenting party entered voluntarily and without documented protest. A brief pause. You entered voluntarily. Under compulsion, Grace began, which returns us to Hancock. The carriage moved through a long grey curve in the road. A stand of bare elms passed the window. Grace was aware, with a clarity that was almost physical, that her three-part argument had just been disassembled in approximately 90 seconds by a man in a ruined coat who had been presenting himself until this moment as a person for whom the written word was a foreign country. She looked at him with the controlled expression of a woman recalibrating every assumption she had made in the last 4 days. Where, she said, very quietly, did you read law? The corner of his mouth moved, that same fractional acknowledgment she had observed in the hallway, present and then withdrawn before it could be properly examined, like a card shown and returned to the deck. He looked back at the window. Sleep if you can. It is a long road to Birmingham. She did not sleep,
This was not surprising. What was surprising was that she had genuinely considered it, had sat with her head resting against the carriage panel for a period of perhaps 20 minutes in the middle hours of the journey, her notebook closed on her lap and her arguments temporarily suspended, listening to the road change beneath the wheels from the outer maintained surfaces of the outer city to the longer, quieter rhythms of open country. There was something almost hypnotic about the motion, and her body, which had not been properly horizontal in 2 days, had registered a quiet and reasonable protest. But her mind had declined to participate. It had too much to work with. The citations alone, Hancock v. Hancock, Smythe v. Registrar General. She had turned these over repeatedly, testing them against her own knowledge of the cases, and found, with the particular discomfort of intellectual honesty, that his application of both had been correct. Not approximately correct, precisely, professionally, citation and principle correct, the kind of correct that did not come from a single reading in a public library on a cold afternoon, but from the deep familiarity of repeated study, of cases used as tools rather than curiosities. She had looked at him twice during the long middle stretch of the journey, in the way one looks at something that requires re-examination without wishing to be observed doing so. He had been either asleep or performing sleep with the same commitment he brought to everything, still, quiet, face entirely composed, one hand resting loose on his knee and the other against the carriage panel, his breathing even. His hands, she noticed again, were the one feature that held a genuine contradiction. The calluses were real, she had seen them in the hallway lamplight, felt their implication in the brief moment of the pen's transfer. Whatever he was, he had also at some point done physical work of the kind that left permanent evidence. This was either the most committed deception she had encountered or the most genuinely complex biography. She was inclining by the time the road began to change again toward the latter. It was Evan's adjustment that alerted her first. She had observed over the course of the journey that Evan drove with the economy of someone who found unnecessary movement wasteful. He did not shift on his seat. He did not adjust his grip. He communicated with the horses through small, efficient signals that produced results without drama. He was, in the vocabulary of his profession, excellent. So when he sat fractionally straighter in the final hour of the journey, a micro-adjustment barely visible through the forward window, Grace looked up from her notebook and paid attention. The road had narrowed and then widened again into a private lane, the transition marked by a change in the surface and in the quality of the maintenance, the difference between public infrastructure and something that was tended by people with a specific obligation to tend it. The trees on either side had grown older and denser, their November branches forming an arch above the lane that in another season would have been a canopy and was now a lattice of bare wood against a sky the color of pewter. They were passing through farmland, not the scrubby, indifferent farmland of the outer counties, but the kind of farmland that spoke of management, of rotation and drainage, and the long-term investment of someone who owned it not as a speculation, but as a responsibility. Fences in good repair, gates hung level, a dry stone wall running the western edge of the lane for a distance that Grace, after a minute of watching it pass, began to find genuinely difficult to account for. She turned to Kyle Adams. He was watching her. He had been watching her, she suspected, since the lane began. His expression was the same as always, composed, unhurried, giving nothing. But there was something in the quality of his attention now that was different from the carriage's interior silence. He was waiting, she understood, for a specific thing, for the moment she understood what she was looking at. The gates appeared around a long curve, and Grace stopped thinking in words entirely for the first time in recent memory. They were iron, and they were very large, and they were flanked by stone pillars that had been standing long enough to have grown a patina of age that could not be manufactured, and was not, by any reasonable assessment, consistent with £43,000 of debt and a man who had spent his mornings on Millhaven Lane with his cap in his hands. Beyond them, visible along a gravel avenue lined with oak trees of spectacular maturity, was the house. Grace looked at it for a long time.
It was not a townhouse. It was not a comfortable country manor of the kind her father's colleagues owned and discussed with the particular satisfaction of men who had arrived somewhere. It was an estate in the original and unambiguous sense, a house that had been built to anchor a landscape rather than inhabit it, its stone facade 3 stories of Georgian proportion stretching across a frontage that she was trying with some difficulty to measure in her mind against anything in her existing experience. The grounds alone were visible for a distance that her father's entire property could have been lost within without leaving an obvious gap. Evan brought the horses to a smooth halt before the gates. 2 men appeared from the gatehouse flanking the pillars, appearing with the promptness of people who had been informed of the arrival in advance, and moved to open them without instruction or signal. They knew the carriage. They knew it the way people know something they have seen approach many times before. Grace turned from the window to Kyle Adams with an expression she did not bother to arrange. He met her eyes with the same gray, precise attention, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth was not quite withdrawn before she saw it. "You said," Grace said, with a careful, deliberate evenness, "that it was a long road to Birmingham." "It is," he agreed. "You did not mention," she gestured briefly at everything beyond the glass. "You did not ask." The carriage moved forward through the open gates, and the gravel of the avenue sounded beneath the wheels like something being formally announced, and Grace Sinclair looked at the house that grew larger with every measured second and understood, with the cold and clarifying precision of a woman whose legal mind had just been handed a fact it could not argue with, that her beggar husband owned more land than her father had ever dreamed of touching. She opened her notebook. She wrote 2 words at the top of the fresh page, pressed the pen firmly enough to feel the resistance of the paper, and underlined them twice. "Who are you?" Then she looked up at him and waited. She was given a room. This was itself a revelation of sorts. Not a room in the diminished sense she had prepared for, a partitioned corner of someone else's domestic arrangement, but a room in the full and unambiguous Victorian meaning of the word. High ceilings, a fireplace that worked, windows overlooking the eastern grounds where the oak trees stood in their November severity like a row of considered arguments. A writing desk positioned beneath those windows with the deliberate thoughtfulness of someone who had known or guessed that its occupant would require one. Her trunk had been brought up before she arrived at the door. This meant it had been carried by people who knew where they were going, which meant the room had been prepared, which meant the preparation had preceded her arrival by long enough for the fire to have reached its current comfortable temperature. Grace stood in the center of it for a moment and took a precise inventory of what this implied. Then she unpacked her 7 law volumes, arranged them on the writing desk in the order she found most useful, and went to find the study. She had identified its likely location during the carriage's approach, reading the house's facade the way she read a document, looking for structure, for the logic of arrangement, for the room that the rest of the building organized itself around. The study of a serious man was never incidental, it was gravitational. And a house of this age and proportion, built by people who understood that the management of an estate was itself a form of governance, would have placed it where the light was best and the interruptions fewest. The northeastern corner, she had estimated, ground floor, accessible from the main corridor, but sufficiently removed from the domestic thoroughfares to discourage casual approach. She found it on her second attempt, which she considered acceptable, given that she had been in the house for less than 2 hours. The door was not locked. This gave her a moment's pause, not because she had been prepared to circumvent a lock, though she had been giving this question practical consideration since the 3rd corridor, but because an unlocked door on a room of obvious significance was either an oversight or an invitation, and neither possibility was entirely comfortable. She went in. The study was everything the house's exterior had promised and the carriage's interior had implied.
It was large without being excessive, and it was arranged with an intelligence that Grace recognized immediately, because it was the same intelligence she applied to her own workspace. Books positioned for use rather than display, papers in systems that looked like disorder and were not, light sources considered. A substantial desk occupied the center, positioned to receive the northeastern light she had predicted, and behind it a chair that had been sat in enough times to have learned the shape of its occupant. She crossed to the desk. The papers on its surface were organized in 3 distinct stacks, and she scanned them with the rapid, practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to extracting information quickly and without guilt. Legal documents, the uppermost stack, correspondence, the second, and the third. Grace stopped. She looked at the third stack for a moment without touching it. Then she picked up the topmost page, and the handwriting confirmed what the quality of the argument had already told her, because it was her own hand, her own ink, the cramped and purposeful script she used when she was writing quickly and didn't care about anyone else reading it. And the page was the 4th sheet of the argument for women's admission to the bar that she had written in her notebook by candlelight over 3 years, and which had been, she had assumed, in the possession of Lady Madeline. She set it down. She picked up the next page, also hers. The next, also hers. The entire argument, all 17 precedents, complete. She was still holding page 9 when the door opened behind her. She did not turn immediately. She finished reading the paragraph she was on, because whatever was about to happen was going to happen regardless of whether she had finished the paragraph, and she had waited 3 years to read this particular page in adequate light. Then she turned. Kyle Adams stood in the doorway. He was standing, not in the wheelchair, standing, fully upright, with the unhurried ease of a man in a room he knew well, his frame considerably more substantial at its full height than the chair had allowed her to estimate. He had changed from the ruined coat into something plain and dark that fit him correctly, and the transformation was not, she understood immediately, merely sartorial. He looked like himself. That was the precise and disorienting truth of it. He looked like the person his eyes had always suggested he was, and the beggar of Millhaven Lane looked from this distance and this vantage like a very good performance by a man who had never needed the role.
He looked at her hands, at his papers in her hands, then at her face. "I would have shown you those," he said, "when the time was right." "And the chair," Grace said, "a necessary inconvenience." She set the papers down on the desk with a care that was not entirely the care of a woman handling documents. It was the care of a woman deciding what to do with her hands while her mind processed the distance between what she had been told and what was standing in front of her. "You should sit," he said, and there was something in the evenness of it that was not unkind. "I think," Grace said, "that you should tell me your name, your actual name." He was quiet for a moment, not the evasive quiet of a man constructing a deflection, but the considered quiet of one deciding where to begin a long and necessary account. "Kyle," he said, "Kyle James Ashford." A brief pause, in which the firelight held them both. "The Duke of Birmingham." Grace looked at him across the desk that was his, in the study that was his, in the house whose gates had announced his arrival with the confidence of something that had never been in any doubt, and she thought of her father's townhouse on Aldgate Street, and the £43,000, and Lady Madeline's smile, and the marriage contract sealed in black wax, and she thought of her 17 precedents arranged on his desk, and the letter from Mr. Rowe that had never been answered, and the 4 years of candlelit study beneath a loose floorboard in a house that had never, in any meaningful sense, been hers. She looked at the Duke of Birmingham. Then, she said, with the precise and deliberate composure of a woman who had been waiting for solid ground long enough to recognize it when she found it, "We have a great deal to discuss." He told her everything. This in itself was notable.
Grace had expected a managed disclosure, the careful release of information in quantities calibrated to maintain his advantage, the kind of tactical transparency that powerful men employed when they wished to appear forthcoming while remaining in control of the room. She had prepared herself to extract, to cross-examine, to read the gaps between what was offered and what was withheld. Instead, he sat across from her at the desk that was his, in the study that was his, and he talked with the direct, unembellished efficiency of a man who had decided that the pretense was finished and that its continuation served neither of them. The deep cover operation had been running for 14 months. There was a corruption network threaded through the lower courts of London's eastern jurisdiction, magistrates, clerks, a handful of solicitors that had been systematically manipulating probate decisions, debt judgments, and inheritance settlements for the benefit of a small consortium of creditors. The men involved were careful and well-connected, and every conventional avenue of investigation had been closed to him by the simple fact that his title made him visible. The Duke of Birmingham could not move through the legal margins of London's East End without announcement. Kyle Adams, beggar of Millhaven Lane, could. He had been close, he said, before the marriage, within 4 weeks of having what he needed. Grace listened to all of this without interruption, which cost her something because she had questions accumulating with considerable velocity. She waited until he had finished, and then she asked the one that mattered most. "My father's debt," she said, "is it in the network?" A pause. "George Sinclair is not part of the corruption. He is a casualty of it. The investment scheme that ruined him was designed by men in this network specifically to create leverageable debt in solicitors of standing. Your father was selected because his reputation made him useful as a hostage." Grace absorbed this. It reorganized several things. "And Lady Madeline?" "Knowingly involved," he said, without inflection. "The beggar arrangement was her suggestion to the consortium. She proposed it herself as a method of neutralizing you specifically. Your legal knowledge made you the family member most likely to investigate the debt's origins if given time and resources." The room was quiet for a moment. "She was afraid of me," Grace said. Not with satisfaction, with the cold, clarifying interest of a woman identifying a structural fact. "She was correct to be," he said. She stood up then, because sitting felt insufficient to the quality of thinking she needed to do. She moved to the window and looked out at the November grounds, while her mind ran forward through the architecture of what he had just given her, testing it, measuring it, identifying where the leverage was and how it could be applied. It took her approximately 4 minutes. She turned back to the desk. "The instruments," she said, "the original documentation your father signed, do you have access to them?" "I have copies. The originals are held by the consortium's primary solicitor, a man named Carruth, at an address in Threadneedle Street." "Carruth prepared them or received them?" "Prepared."
Then his preparation is the exposure point. She came back to the desk and stood with both hands resting on its surface and the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for a problem she was actually equipped to solve. A solicitor who prepares fraudulent debt instruments is not merely a criminal, he is a disbarrable criminal. The Law Society has mechanisms for exactly this, and those mechanisms, unlike criminal prosecution, do not require a sympathetic magistrate. She paused, which I assume is why conventional routes have been difficult. "Every magistrate in the eastern jurisdiction is either involved or compromised," he confirmed.
Then we go above the jurisdiction entirely. She straightened. The Solicitors Act of 1843 grants the Master of the Rolls direct disciplinary authority over solicitors independently of the criminal courts. If we can document Carruth's preparation of the instruments with sufficient specificity, dates, parties, the deliberate misrepresentation of the investment's legal standing, we bring it to the Master of the Rolls directly, bypassing every compromised magistrate in London's East End. She looked at him. What I need is a complete record of the instruments, every debt in the network with its originating documentation, and testimony from at least 2 parties who received these instruments under duress. Your father would be one, he said. My father will do what is required of him, Grace said, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had assessed this variable thoroughly and arrived at a conclusion. He is not dishonest, he is simply accustomed to being afraid. That is a correctable condition. The Duke of Birmingham looked at her across the desk with those grey, precise eyes, and for the first time since the hallway on Friday evening, the thing at the corner of his mouth was not withdrawn. It stayed. It became, with the unhurried deliberateness that characterized everything about him, something that was unambiguously a smile. I have 14 months of documented intelligence, he said. Names, dates, transactions, correspondence. I have been waiting for a legal mind capable of building a case from it that will hold. You have one now, Grace said. They worked through the night. Evan brought a tray at some point, tea, bread, cold meat, and set it on the corner of the desk with the wordless efficiency of a man entirely unsurprised to find the study occupied at midnight by 2 people surrounded by legal documents. He withdrew without comment. He was, Grace was developing a comprehensive appreciation, a man of excellent professional judgment. By 3 in the morning, the architecture of the case was complete. By 4, Grace had drafted the preliminary petition to the Master of the Rolls in the clean, unambiguous hand she used for documents that needed to be taken seriously. By 5, when the first grey suggestion of light appeared at the study's northeastern windows, she had cross-referenced every instrument against the 3 precedents most likely to compel disciplinary action, annotated the margins in the manner her father had taught her without knowing he was doing so, and produced, across 11 pages, the most consequential legal document she had ever written.
She set down the pen. She looked at the pages. Then she looked across the desk at the Duke, who had spent the hours matching her pace without complaint, locating documents with the speed of a man who knew his own archive, offering corroborating detail with the precision of someone whose 14 months of evidence had been waiting for exactly this organization. Madeline, Grace said, will lose her position in the Sinclair household, her access to the estate, and her social standing, in that order. The consortium will be disbarred and prosecuted. My father's debt will be exposed as fraudulently constructed and therefore unenforceable. She paused. And my correspondence with Mr. Rowe can be reinstated. It can, he said, though I would suggest, he paused in a way that was careful rather than hesitant, that Rowe and Partners, whatever its merits, is not the only avenue currently available to you. Grace looked at him steadily. What avenue did you have in mind? I require a legal advisor, he said, someone with a comprehensive understanding of the Eastern jurisdiction's corruption, an established fluency with the Master of Rolls' procedural requirements, and, the fractional pause, a personal investment in the outcome. The fire had burned low. The study's lamplight held them both in its quiet, sufficient radius. Outside, the Birmingham estate stood in its November silence, solid and unhurried, a thing that had been certain of itself for a very long time. Grace Sinclair looked at the Duke of Birmingham across 11 pages of the most important work she had ever done, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the specific and clarifying sensation of a woman standing on ground that was entirely, unambiguously, finally her own. I would require, she said, access to the full archive, independent authority over the legal strategy, and acknowledgement in writing that the work is mine. Done, he said, without hesitation. She picked up the pen. She turned to a fresh page. Then, said Grace Sinclair, let us begin.
Thank you for staying till the end. Grace and Kyle's story is one of hidden power, quiet defiance, and two brilliant minds finding each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. If this story made you lean forward, turn pages faster, or feel that fierce satisfaction when Grace picked up the pen, then you already know this world deserves to be told in full. Grace Sinclair has waited long enough. So have you. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment?